Russia now has active military forces on the ground inside Ukraine. Russia is not calling this an invasion of Ukraine, and Western leaders are also picking their words carefully, but for all practical purposes, Russia has now invaded Ukraine. So how did we get here? Well, things would never have escalated to the level of violence that they're at now without Russian support or orchestration. But with that said, Ukraine is a historically divided nation, and the conflict as a whole is about a divide and the country's lack of a cohesive national identity. Ukraine has become largely split between the East and the West, roughly along this line. It's often talked about in the press as a divide between the ethnically Ukrainian and Ukrainian-speaking West and the ethnically Russian and Russian-speaking East. But that's a bit of an oversimplification. The conflict between these two groups is really about the future of the country and its current national identity, or lack thereof. Many people in Western Ukraine would like the country to move away from Russian influence. They'd like to become more aligned with the EU and more self-reliant. Many people in the East also want a self-reliant Ukraine, but they'd like the country to remain aligned with Russia. And they can't fully identify with the Ukrainian nationalist movement because it centers around Ukrainian language and traditions, ignoring their Russian roots. This doesn't mean that the East wants to join Russia, it just means that they'd like to keep a close bond with their former homeland. The divide stems from how Ukraine was formed and how they were treated under Russian rule prior to their re-establishing independence in 1991. Prior to 1991, Ukraine hadn't had an extensive period of self-rule since the 1600s. They were independent for a brief moment after World War I, but that didn't last long enough to establish one Ukrainian culture or national identity. They've largely been under Russian control for the last 400 years. And going as far back as the 1700s, there have been programs put in place by Russian leaders to Russify eastern Ukraine. This started with Catherine the Great and continued all the way through Stalin's rule. Russia wanted to make the coal-rich, iron-rich, and more fertile regions of Ukraine as closely connected to them as possible. These regions happened to mostly be on the eastern side of the country. Soviet and pre-Soviet Russia has a history of relocating entire populations out of Ukraine and replacing them with Russian citizens. They also have a history of outlawing Ukrainian language and culture, indoctrinating Ukrainian children with Russian ideals in school, and Stalin even instituted a program that intentionally starved Ukrainian populations. Understandably, this has led to some bad blood towards Russia from the ethnically Ukrainian western part of the country. But it also brought a lot of Russians into Ukraine, which generated greater sympathy for Russian culture and Russia itself among the people in the eastern side of the country. Today, these tensions are exacerbated by a terrible Ukrainian economy, Moscow's military support of Russian separatist groups actually invading Ukraine, far-right Ukrainian nationalist groups alienating ethnically Russian Ukrainians, the shooting down of Malaysian Airlines Flight 17, Russia's forced annexation of Crimea, and huge media biases on both sides. You can paint the Ukrainian conflict as a continuation of their independence movement and another step in the battle against Russian control, but that ignores a lot of the issues that currently divide the Ukraine people. To find out more about Flight MH17 and media bias in this country, please click on this video now.
Let's just look at what we know about Russian public opinion. Is the Russian public's version of world events different than the West's?
And if you need a break from the serious news, click on the box to check out my series, Everything But the News, on PBS Digital Studios.